We will talk about points of information first, briefly, explaining what they are, why they are important, and why we talk about them today. And then in the second part, we will talk about the exercise, which is going to be a brief one. So firstly, on points of information, right? So POIs on the shorthand. Two things are important. One, it needs to be a question, so it cannot be just a statement. You need to ask the person a question, and then secondly, it should not take you more than 15 seconds, because this is, generally against the rules if we do competitive debating, but also just in terms of, we want to have a concise question that points to something, and not just, have a long question that doesn't really get the same point across, because you want to be succinct in debate, because you have a limited amount of time that you can make your point in. Okay, so why do we use POIs? What are the two ways, the most common ways? So POIs generally are there to expose the logic of the other team, right? So you want to question what they are defending, or how they are defending it, or in which cases they are defending it. So the first way how we can use them is simply to clarify positions. So for example, if our proposition, let's say a motion on this house would ban all personal cars, right? So a proposition then says we are talking only about luxury cars. A point of clarification would be asking, do you mean to include every car, or is it just luxury cars? So seeing where the other team's position is, this is the first point of the POIs. Secondly, it can be used to explain certain logical flaws of the other team, in terms of that you point out what they are not addressing. So for example, again on the same motion as this house would ban on personal vehicles, explaining why at the end of the day, they are not addressing, for example, rural voters. So the proposition makes an argument saying, cars are not essential for people living in the cities, this is good because we get better quality of life in the city. You in opposition can put up a POI asking them, what about everyone that lives in the rural areas, that doesn't live in the cities, that does not get those benefits? So this is what the POIs are supposed to be, very briefly, very essential, but they are kind of not used enough in debate, effectively. So what we are going to do? So we are going to have someone, so everyone should prep for a first proposition speech on the motion I'm going to give. You won't know who is going to deliver it, and I will pick someone before the debate starts. And you don't have to worry about it. Why? Because after 1 minute, the rest of you will start asking POIs, and the speaker must accept all points of information. Which means that we are making an 8-minute speech where essentially you only need to worry about 1.5 minutes, because afterwards it's going to be responses to the questions. So we want you to be engaging, just you need to know your outline, what you would argue, how you would defend yourself, and then be just ready to accept as many questions. And the rest of you, so don't only think about the arguments you are making if you are first prop, also think about what questions you will ask if you are not going to make those questions, right? So what might be potential tricky areas, what might be some questions of clarification? Yeah, Dominic, there's a question.
Yes, does that mean a proper first speech? Like
no. I mean, it depends on you, yes, so just tell me what the context of the motion is, but then you don't need to go into the details, but yeah, proper first proposition speech. Okay, that's it. So, we are agreeing with the motion, and we are going to start. Okay, so thumbs up. Dominic, you're going to deliver the speech.
Of course.
Okay, everyone else, POIs, and lots of them. Cool, so, the floor is yours.
Just FYI, this is my first speech in like 2 years or so. Yeah. Fun time. I'm the first speaker of science exposition, and today we are debating the motion. This house believes that free speech must always be protected. So, first of all, some definitions, then moving on to a stance, and then moving on to neutral argument, to substantive arguments, hopefully. Okay, so first of all, when it comes to the definition, the freedom of speech is the ability of people to actually be able to express their own opinions, say what they want, and that not being limited by an external source, most commonly that being the government. The government is usually, or an authority when it comes to authoritarian regimes, where essentially it's the limiting of most common breakings of this sort of freedom of speech usually comes in authoritarian countries and it comes to disagreeing with leaders and things like that. So what our stance is here is that freedom of speech is a fundamental human right and must always be protected. We believe that this is something that we have to protect no matter what, and to prove this, first thing is a principle argument. So we believe principally freedom of speech is something that should fundamentally be available to everyone, because in general when it comes to taking away these sort of rights. Yes?
So would you ban hate speech?
No, I guess it wouldn't.
Point.
Yeah.
Does that mean there would be any retaliations at the point of which hate speech happens?
What do you mean? Oh yeah, I know what you mean. I guess the answer would be we think that principally, because when it comes to actually, because we think that in this case that everyone has a right to express their own opinions, we believe that they have the right to talk about things, even things that the current sort of leading, the people leading a country might disagree with.
Point.
And yes, please. Yeah.
What about people spreading COVID misinformation, for example?
We think that when it comes to spreading of COVID misinformation, this is obviously something that is quite harmful for people, and like for people who actually believe in this. But we think that by limiting these sorts of things that can easily be disproven, we're essentially only exacerbating the problems and making people actually believe that the things that they're trying to cover up are true. Because when it comes to general these sorts of conspiracy theorists, if you were to, I don't know, say that the thing that they believe in is something that they should not talk about, and something that should be that is not acceptable to talk about in freedom of speech, ultimately they will not stop believing things like this, and will only perpetuate the problems. Yes, please.
Are people responsible for what they say in public?
What do you
So,
mean?
if you say something that might not be okay with everyone, do you take the responsibility on you when you say that?
Yeah, well, people obviously take responsibility for what they're saying. This isn't about freedom of speech. Like, we give them the opportunity to say what they say. We think that's a fundamental right that we should not have and should be protected. But we think that essentially the people saying things that they definitely should stand behind. And okay, moving on to yes, please.
How exactly would you protect free speech?
We would protect free speech by essentially. We think that the organs that, I mean, the parties that have the power to actually limit free speech should not be given such an opportunity. So in general, when it comes to these sorts of governments or authoritarian powers, that they should not be given the opportunity to limit free speech.
Point.
I don't know, yes, please.
Referring to the previous statement about misinformation, how would you deal with things that aren't necessarily misinformation, but are, as a matter of fact, a subjective perception that is presented as subjective and consequently negatively influences people that take it for objective thing?
Yeah, we think that there's nothing wrong with things like that, right? Because in general, just because somebody is saying something that isn't true or something that can be an opinion does not mean that we should take their power away, even if it sort of negatively influences people, because essentially that's how it can actually start. Because the biggest step when it comes to limiting the freedom of speech is the first one. We think that this on our side, we think that essentially the moment people accept that you are limiting speech, they will ultimately become more accepting towards greater and greater limits of said speech or even infringing on other rights. We can see this happening in the COVID lockdown because first of all, we always understood the fact that we had to stay in our homes and that the municipalities got locked so that we wouldn't go anywhere, right? But essentially, the moment that the first step was taken, the government could much easily limit people even further, which we see with policijska ulica, I forgot how that's in English, which are essentially something that was completely not even something that wasn't even meant to be, it wasn't supported by the medicinal staff and was essentially done by the government just because it was something that they could do and they could limit us even further. And we think that the same sort of principle applies to the taking away of the freedom of speech because essentially what happens is that once you start taking away of freedom of speech, maybe it can be used like as a scapegoat. You say, yeah, we're banning misinformation about COVID, and next you're banning misinformation about vaccines, you're banning misinformation about something else, and then ultimately it all steps up to making it, for instance, limiting press or to making it harder for moving on beyond just like COVID and things like that. And yes, please.
Referring to what you said about subjectivity not being harmful, do you not think subjectivity under a false pretense of objectivity is essentially manipulation?
Yeah, but I don't see why that's something that should indistinguishably rise into this. Oh, okay. We don't think that this is something that should inherently be taken away because while these sorts of manipulations can be seen as harmful, we don't think that because something that you say is harmful essentially gives the government the right to take this away. And we also think that this will ultimately make it harder, for instance, to actually politically participate in these sorts of things and expressing your opinions because the very fact that these sorts of freedom of speeches can be taken away, a form of political participation can also be taken away just as easily because the easiest way to show this agreement is by talking about this. And if you're unable to present this sort of basic level of political participation, who knows what's next. Thanks.
Okay. So to wrap it up, I think that Dominic helped very well on the POIs that we put up, so especially after not doing a first round revise. I think that, just two things that I want to highlight here about the POIs, right? So I think that you were good at, playing the philosopher in the sense of what are we talking about, what are the particular cases Dominic wants to defend, what are the particular situations that we're talking about. So for example, you asked him a lot of questions about things like, what exactly would he do with manipulation? And in that case of manipulation, what would happen? Similar things like that, so subjectivity and so on. I think that what's a missed opportunity in Dominic's speech is to try to attack him on his content. Right? Because he does manage to get into his principle a bit, where he says that everyone's right exists, that everyone should have a right to express their opinions. Right? So that this should be an unconstrained right, no external constraint should exist, deploying, negative conception of freedom. I think that a question that would be posed to Dominic that would be much more based on content rather than just seeking which areas his case doesn't cover is asking him, for example, how does his principle weigh up against the right of the minority, especially oppressed minorities, to not be heavily harmed by speech like hate speech, which Dominic actually accepts he won't limit. So this is something that you guys want to use it more. So I think that good in terms of you find areas when you can ask POIs and that's a mandate from you, and that's great. But again, you want to start thinking more of POIs in terms of how can I show the weaknesses of the other side, not only in the scope they cover, but what are the problematic things they are defending, right? So I think that in this case, some of the questions like that could have gone more. So try to be more of a philosopher when asking POIs rather than doing just questions in terms of technicalities. Okay, so thank you everyone for this 2 hours of our lessons. Thanks for taking your time and thanks for participating. And I hope you got something from it. And yeah, thanks for the consent points about it. Not for starting.